August the 13th, 1704. The village of Blenheim, Bavaria. The sun is reaching its zenith over the Danube River, illuminating a scene of impending catastrophe. On one side stands the army of France, the invincible war machine of King Louis XIV, the Sun King. They are the masters of Europe, undefeated for half a century, the enforcement arm of a superpower that treats the rest of the continent as mere provinces. On the other side stands a ragtag coalition of English, Dutch, Danes, and Germans. They are far from home, exhausted, and led by a man whom the French command regards with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. He is an Englishman, a representative of a small island nation known more for its internal civil wars than its martial prowess. To the French marshals across the field, the idea that this man could halt the expansion of the Bourbon Empire is laughable. The man sitting atop his horse, scanning the enemy lines through a brass telescope, is John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough. He does not look like a man on the brink of annihilation. Witnesses describe him as possessing a supernatural calm, a serenity of soul that seems to deepen as the chaos of battle intensifies. He wears the scarlet coat of the English army, but across his chest is pinned the diamond star of the Order of the Garter, glittering in the sunlight, making him a beacon for every enemy marksman. He ignores the danger. He is looking for something specific. He is looking for the hinge of the battle, the psychological and physical breaking point of the enemy. This moment at Blenheim is the fulcrum of modern history. Before this day, Britain was a peripheral player, a naval nuisance with a negligible land army. After this day, Britain would begin its ascent to becoming the greatest empire the world has ever seen. And the architect of this transformation was not a king or a prime minister, but this singular, complex and deeply flawed general. John Churchill is the godfather of the British Army. Without him, there is no Wellington, no Montgomery, no tradition of the thin red line. He taught the British how to win, but to understand the genius of Marlborough, we must first confront the paradox of his character. He is perhaps the most difficult man in military history to pin down. On the battlefield, he was an angel of deliverance, a commander who never fought a battle he did not win, nor besieged a fortress he did not take. He possessed a mind that saw warfare not as a static geometry, but as a fluid, living thing. He understood logistics, morale, and the terrifying power of speed in an age of slow-moving armies. He was a diplomat of supreme skill, holding together a fracturing alliance of jealous nations through sheer charm, flattery, and patience. Yet, off the battlefield, the portrait darkens. John Churchill was a man of cold calculation. He rose from the ashes of a family ruined by the English Civil War, and the poverty of his youth left him with a pathological fear of being poor again. He was avaricious, often accused of loving money more than honour. He was a political chameleon who betrayed two kings to secure his own survival. He abandoned James II, his patron and mentor, in the middle of the night, defecting to the invading William of Orange. Later, serving William, he would secretly write to the exiled James, hedging his bets in case the winds of fortune shifted once more. Historians have wrestled with this duality for 3 centuries. Was he a patriot who did what was necessary to save Protestant Europe from French tyranny? Or was he a supreme mercenary, a man who would sell his soul for a shilling, but fight like a lion for a sovereign? The truth, as it often does, lies in the synthesis of these extremes. His ambition was the engine of his genius. His desire for wealth and status drove him to perfect the art of war. Because for Marlborough, victory was the only currency that mattered. As the cannons begin to roar at Blenheim, we see the culmination of a lifetime of preparation. This is not just a battle, it is the collision of the old world and the new. The French fight by the old rules, valuing position and manoeuvre. Marlborough is about to rewrite the textbook. He is about to introduce the concept of annihilation. But to understand how he arrived at this field, commanding the destiny of Europe, we must go back to the beginning. we must look at the crucible that forged him, and the strange twist of fate that saw Britain's greatest general learn his trade in the service of the very enemy he was now destined to destroy. The story begins in the wreckage of the English Civil War. John Churchill was born in 1650 at Ash House in Devon, but it was a birthright of ashes rather than silver spoons. His father, Winston Churchill, had been a staunch royalist who backed the losing side. The family was destitute, living on the charity of relatives, stripped of their estates and their dignity by the victorious parliamentarians. This early exposure to the humiliation of poverty burned a mark onto the young John's psyche that would never fade. It created a hunger in him, a desperate, clawing need for security and status. He learned early on that principles were noble, but gold was survival. When the monarchy was restored under Charles II in 1660, the Churchills returned to favour, but the money did not follow. The young John was sent to court, not as a wealthy heir, but as a page boy who had to sing for his supper. It was here, in the shark tank of the Restoration Court, that he first honed his weapons. He had no fortune, but he had himself. He was possessed of a striking beauty, an easy grace, and a charm that could disarm the most cynical courtier. He learned that a smile and a well-placed compliment could open doors that were locked to men of mere talent. He learned to be opaque, to hide his true thoughts behind a mask of polite agreeability. This was the diplomat in training, the man who would one day charm kings and emperors into doing his bidding. But court intrigue was not enough to satisfy his ambition. He needed a stage where merit mattered more than lineage. He chose the army. In the 1670s, the English army was a negligible force, often acting as a mercenary auxiliary to the true superpower of the age, France. In a profound historical irony, the young Churchill was sent to the continent to fight under the command of King Louis XIV as part of an English brigade loaned to the French. His destination was the finishing school of war. He was placed under the command of the Marshal General of France, Henri de la Tour d'Auvergne, Vicomte de Turenne. Turenne was a legend, a master of strategy who was revolutionizing warfare. In an era where most generals were obsessed with the geometric perfection of siegecraft, spending months digging trenches around a single fortress, Turenne believed in movement. He believed in the indirect approach, in marching hard to strike the enemy where they were unprepared. Churchill, then a young captain, watched Turenne with the obsession of a starving student. He saw how the marshal commanded not with shouting and fury, but with a quiet, intellectual intensity. Turenne possessed what the French called coup d'œil, or the stroke of the eye, the ability to glance at a chaotic landscape and instantly understand its tactical advantages. Churchill absorbed this. He learned that terrain was a weapon. He learned that a battle was won before the first shot was fired, through logistics and positioning. The French court took notice of this peculiar English volunteer. They called him the handsome Englishman, a somewhat dismissive nickname that belied his ferocity. At the siege of Maastricht in 1673, Churchill led a storming party over the walls with such reckless bravery that he was publicly thanked by Louis XIV himself. The Sun King, in a moment of supreme arrogance, praised the young officer, completely unaware that he was patting the head of the man who would one day dismantle his empire. This period was the crucible. Churchill was learning the French playbook from the inside out. He saw the magnificent organization of their supply lines, the devastating power of their heavy cavalry, and the rigid discipline of their infantry. But he also saw their flaws. He noted the arrogance of their high command, the rigid adherence to protocol that could make them slow to react to the unexpected. He saw that the French army was a machine designed to crush inferior opponents, but it relied heavily on the script of predictable warfare. When Churchill returned to England, he was no longer just a courtier with a sword. He was a professional soldier who had seen the face of modern war. He carried with him the lessons of Turenne, the value of speed, the necessity of aggression, and the understanding that rules were made to be broken. But his rise was not yet inevitable. As the 17th century drew to a close, England was sliding toward another crisis. The Catholic King James II, Churchill's longtime patron and the man to whom he owed his career, was steering the country toward a collision with Parliament. Churchill faced a choice that would define his character forever. He had to choose between loyalty to the man who had made him and the survival of the nation and the career he had built. The ambition that had been forged in the poverty of Ashley House was about to be tested against his honour. The year is 1688. The glorious revolution is underway. William of Orange has landed at Torbay with a Dutch army, ostensibly to save English Protestantism from the Catholic King James II. The country is holding its breath. The king turns to his most capable commander, the man he raised from nothing, John Churchill. He promotes him to lieutenant general and entrusts him with the defence of the realm. James believes that Churchill, the creature of his own making, will stand as his firewall. He is wrong. On the night of November the 23rd, at the Royal Army camp near Salisbury, Churchill makes his move. It is a masterclass in cold calculation. Under the cover of darkness, he rides out of the king's camp with 400 officers and men, defecting directly to the invading Dutch prince. He leaves behind a letter for the king, filled with pained justifications about the sanctity of the Protestant religion, but the act speaks louder than the ink. It is a mortal blow to James II. When the king hears the news, his will to fight collapses. The army disintegrates. The king flees. This betrayal haunts Churchill's legacy. To his defenders, it was a supreme act of patriotism, sacrificing personal loyalty for the greater good of the nation. To his detractors, it was the ultimate opportunism, a rat sensing the sinking ship and leaping to the stronger vessel. The truth is likely that Churchill saw the inevitability of James's fall and refused to be buried under the rubble. He chose the winning side, ensuring his survival, but he paid for it with his reputation. For the rest of his life, he would be viewed with suspicion. If he could betray the man who made him, who could ever trust him? King William III certainly did not. The new monarch was a dour, pragmatic Dutchman and a soldier himself. He recognized Churchill's brilliance, but he despised his character. For the next decade, Churchill lived in a twilight world. He was given titles and commands, but he was kept at arm's length. William knew that Churchill was hedging his bets. In a display of breathtaking duplicity, even while serving as William's general, Churchill was secretly writing letters to the exiled James II in France, asking for forgiveness and promising loyalty should the old king ever return. This was Churchill's insurance policy. He was playing both sides of history, determined to land on his feet no matter which way the coin fell. This dangerous game nearly destroyed him. In 1692, accusations of treason saw him stripped of his offices and thrown into the Tower of London. For 6 weeks, the man who would be the greatest general of his age sat in a damp cell, staring at the stone walls, his career seemingly over. He was 42 years old, disgraced, and politically radioactive. But Churchill possessed a weapon even more powerful than his military mind: his wife, Sarah. The relationship between John and Sarah Churchill is the emotional core of this story. It was a love match in an age of arranged marriages, passionate, volatile, and deeply political. Sarah was fierce, intelligent, and famously difficult. Most importantly, she was the childhood best friend and confidant of the Princess Anne, the heir to the throne. While John languished in the political wilderness, Sarah held the heart of the future queen. In 1702, the wheel of fortune turned. King William died after a fall from his horse. Queen Anne ascended the throne. In an instant, the Churchills went from outcasts to the most powerful couple in England. Anne, who was dependent on Sarah's emotional support and guidance, immediately appointed John Churchill as Captain General of her forces. He was 52 years old, an age when most generals of the era were looking toward retirement. He stepped onto the world stage at a moment of supreme crisis. The War of the Spanish Succession had erupted. It was a conflict of staggering scale, a World War I that pitted the might of a unified France and Spain against the rest of Europe. The French King Louis XIV sought to place his grandson on the Spanish throne, effectively erasing the Pyrenees and creating a Bourbon hegemony that would dominate the globe. Marlborough was tasked with leading the armies of the Grand Alliance, a bickering, fragile coalition of Dutch, Austrians, Prussians, and Danes. He arrived in the Low Countries not just as a general, but as the glue holding the alliance together. He faced a French army that was larger, better funded, and commanded by marshals who viewed him as a washed-up courtier. They expected him to play by the rules, to maneuver cautiously, to besiege a few towns, and to avoid major battles. They had no idea that the man they were facing had spent 30 years studying their playbook specifically to dismantle it. The apprentice was about to become the master. The early years of the war, 1702 and 1703, were a lesson in frustration. Marlborough was nominally the commander-in-chief, but his power was strictly checked by the Dutch government. The Dutch, traumatized by decades of French invasions, were obsessed with defense. They attached field deputies, civilian bureaucrats, to Marlborough's headquarters. These men had veto power over his decisions. Whenever Marlborough saw an opening to strike, the deputies would urge caution, preferring to besiege a town rather than risk the army in open battle. For a commander of Marlborough's vision, this was torture. He described it as being chained to a corpse, but these frustrations forced him to crystallize his own philosophy of war. The prevailing doctrine of the 18th century was one of geometric caution. Generals moved armies like chess pieces, seeking to capture territory or fortresses. Battle was avoided because soldiers were expensive and hard to replace. Marlborough rejected this entirely. He understood a terrifying truth: a war of sieges could last forever, bleeding the treasury dry. To win, he had to destroy the enemy's capacity to fight. His objective was not a hill or a fortress. It was the annihilation of the French field army. He sought the decisive action. He also revolutionized the machinery of war. He knew that a hungry soldier is a useless soldier. In an era where armies often starved or dissolved into banditry to survive, Marlborough became a master of logistics. He obsessed over bread wagons, the quality of boots, and the timing of pay. He enforced strict discipline. Pillaging was punishable by death, which meant the local populations did not rise up against him. His men, whom he affectionately called "my rascals," began to trust that Corporal John would never waste their lives needlessly, nor let them go hungry. By 1704, the war had reached a critical juncture. The French had allied with the Elector of Bavaria, creating a massive force deep in the heart of Germany. Their target was Vienna, the capital of the Holy Roman Empire. If Vienna fell, the empire would collapse, the Grand Alliance would shatter, and France would win the war. The Dutch, concerned only with their own borders, refused to let Marlborough take the army south to save Vienna. They wanted him to stay in the Low Countries to guard their canals. Marlborough hatched a plan of breathtaking audacity. He decided to lie to everyone. He told the Dutch he was moving south to the Moselle River for a limited campaign. He told the French the same thing. In reality, he intended to march his army 250 miles from the North Sea to the Danube, right across the face of the enemy, to strike at the heart of the Franco-Bavarian force. It was a strategic gamble that could have ended in total disaster. If the French realized his true objective, they could cut his supply lines and destroy him. The march to the Danube began in May 1704. It remains one of the greatest feats of logistics in military history. As the Scarlet Caterpillar, a column of redcoats miles long, wound its way through Germany, Marlborough's genius for organization shone. He sent officers ahead to arrange food depots and new shoes for the soldiers at every stage. He marched in the cool of the early morning to avoid the heat, allowing the men to rest in the afternoon. The French were paralyzed by indecision. Because Marlborough kept his destination secret, feinting first toward the Moselle, and then into Alsace, the French marshals froze. They couldn't decipher his intent. Was he attacking the forts on the Rhine? Was he invading France itself? By the time they realized he was heading for the Danube, it was too late. He had slipped the net. When Marlborough arrived at the Danube, his army was not an exhausted wreck, but a fighting force in prime condition. It was here that he met his counterpart, Prince Eugene of Savoy, the commander of the Austrian imperial forces. Eugene was a man who shared Marlborough's aggressive spirit and his disdain for defensive warfare. When they met, it was described as two bodies sharing a single soul. They immediately agreed to combine their forces and seek battle. They found the enemy near the village of Blenheim. The French and Bavarians, commanded by Marshal Tallard, had taken up a strong defensive position behind a marshy stream called the Nebel. They had 56,000 men and 90 cannons. Marlborough and Eugene had 52,000 men and 66 cannons. The French assumed Marlborough would retreat. The conventional wisdom was that you did not attack a larger army in a prepared position. But Marlborough had marched 250 miles for this moment. He snapped his telescope shut and ordered the impossible. He would attack. The morning of August 13th broke with a thick mist covering the marshy ground around the Nebel stream. As the sun burned through the fog, the French commanders were stunned to see the Allied army deploying in battle formation. Marshal Tallard, confident in his position, believed Marlborough was bluffing. The French line was anchored on the right by the village of Blenheim, which sat on the banks of the Danube, and on the left by dense woods. Between these two strong points lay the centre, open ground, but protected by the marshy, boggy banks of the Nebel. Tallard considered the centre impassable for cavalry and artillery. He assumed that any attack would have to come against his wings, so he packed the village of Blenheim with his best infantry, turning it into a fortress. Marlborough, watching from a rise, saw exactly what Tallard had done. He saw the trap, but he also saw the flaw. By overcommitting his troops to the village, Tallard had thinned his centre. Marlborough's plan was a masterpiece of misdirection. He would launch ferocious assaults on both the French left and right wings, forcing Tallard to feed even more reserves into those grinders. Then, once the French centre was stripped bare, Marlborough would do the unthinkable. He would bridge the impassable marsh and drive a steel wedge through the middle of the enemy line. The battle began at noon. On the left, Lord Cutts led the British infantry against the village of Blenheim. It was a slaughter. The French had turned the houses and hedges into a kill zone. Wave after wave of redcoats charged the palisades, only to be cut down by withering volleys of musketry. But they did not stop. Their relentless pressure panicked the French commander inside the village, who demanded more troops. Tallard obliged, sucking his reserves from the centre and cramming them into the already overcrowded village. Marlborough's bait had been taken. Meanwhile, on the far right, Prince Eugene was engaged in a desperate, seesaw battle against the Bavarian forces. Eugene's role was to hold the enemy in place, to suffer and bleed, so that Marlborough could win the centre. He did so with grim determination, launching attack after attack to pin the Bavarian wings. By late afternoon, the trap was set. The French wings were pinned, their reserves committed to the edges of the battlefield. The centre was vulnerable. Now Marlborough played his hand. Under intense French artillery fire, his engineers had been frantically laying down fascines, bundles of sticks and planks across the marshy Nebel stream. Slowly, methodically, the Allied cavalry began to cross. It was a moment of supreme danger. If the French charged while Marlborough's horsemen were struggling through the mud, the battle would be lost. But the French cavalry, adhering to the old rules of passive defence, waited for them to cross, intending to charge them only once they were formed. It was a fatal error. Once across, Marlborough took personal command. He formed his cavalry into two massive lines with infantry support tucked between the squadrons, a combined arms tactic the French had never seen. At 5 p.m, with the sun beginning to dip, Marlborough ordered the advance. The pace was slow at first, a trot that shook the ground. 80 squadrons of horsemen, a wall of steel and horseflesh, began to roll toward the French centre. The French cavalry tried to countercharge, but they were exhausted and demoralized. The Allied infantry volleys shattered their formation, and then Marlborough's heavy cavalry smashed into them. The impact was cataclysmic. The French centre buckled, then broke. The invincible army of Louis XIV was cut in two. The rout that followed was absolute. Marshal Tallard, the commander of the French army, was captured while trying to flee. The thousands of French infantry trapped in the village of Blenheim, surrounded and cut off, surrendered en masse. As the sun set, the field was covered with 30,000 casualties. The French army had not just been defeated, it had been obliterated. The threat to Vienna was gone. The myth of French invincibility was shattered. And standing amidst the smoke and the ruin, unhurt and calm as ever, was John Churchill. He took a bill of tavern expenses from his pocket and scribbled a note to his wife, Sarah. "I have not time to say more, but to beg you will give my duty to the Queen, and let her know her army has had a glorious victory." Blenheim made Marlborough a legend. He returned to England not merely as a general, but as a colossus. Queen Anne bestowed upon him the dukedom and granted him the royal manor of Woodstock, where a grateful nation would build him a palace named after his greatest victory, Blenheim Palace. It was the only non-royal residence in England to hold the title of palace, a stone testament to his unparalleled status. But while the masonry was being laid, the war raged on. The French, though bloodied, were a superpower with deep reserves. They rebuilt their armies with terrifying speed, and by 1706, they were ready to test the Englishmen again. This time, the challenge came in the Spanish Netherlands, modern-day Belgium. The French king, Louis XIV, stung by the humiliation of Blenheim, urged his commander, Marshal Villeroy, to seek battle and crush the upstart Duke. Villeroy was eager to oblige. On May 23, 1706, near the village of Ramillies, the two armies met. If Blenheim was a triumph of courage and shock, Ramillies would be a masterpiece of intellect and deception. It remains perhaps the finest example of 18th century tactical maneuvering ever recorded. The battlefield was dominated by a vast, open plain, perfect for cavalry. Villeroy, confident in his numbers, 60,000 men matching Marlborough's 62,000, drew up his army in a concave arc, a crescent shape intended to envelop the Allies. He placed his best troops, the Maison du Roi, the King's Household Cavalry, on his right flank, expecting the main blow to fall there. Marlborough, scanning the field from a high ridge, spotted a subtle geographical feature that Villeroy had missed. The Allied line was shorter than the French line, meaning Marlborough could move troops from one wing to another faster than his enemy could. More importantly, there was a dip in the ground behind the Allied centre, a reverse slope that hid troop movements from French observers. The Duke began his performance. He launched a noisy, aggressive feint against the French left, attacking the village of Autre-Église with his red-coated infantry. To Villeroy, this looked like the main assault. Panic set in. The French marshal frantically stripped units from his centre and right to reinforce the threatened left. He was reacting exactly as Marlborough had predicted. As the French troops rushed to the left, Marlborough executed his sleight of hand. He ordered his cavalry on the opposite wing, his right, to disengage. They rode back down the reverse slope, out of sight of the French, and galloped furiously across the rear of the battlefield to join the main body on the left. To Villeroy, looking through his telescope, the Allied right wing still appeared to be in place, because the regimental standards, flags, had been left behind on the ridge to maintain the illusion. In reality, Marlborough had just achieved massive local superiority. He had secretly massed almost his entire cavalry force against the weakened French right. When he unleashed them, the effect was overwhelming. The French household cavalry, the pride of Versailles, found themselves outnumbered 5-1. They fought bravely, but they were swamped by the sheer weight of the Allied charge. But the battle was not without its cost. In the heat of the melee, Marlborough threw himself into the fray to rally a faltering squadron. It was a moment of madness for a commander-in-chief. He was recognized by French dragoons who surged toward him, slashing at him with swords. He was knocked from his horse, tumbling into a ditch. As he scrambled to his feet, dazed and vulnerable, a French trooper swung a sabre at his head. He was saved only by the arrival of his equerry, Colonel Bringfield, who brought a fresh horse. As Marlborough mounted, a cannonball, likely a stray shot, tore Bringfield's head clean off his shoulders, the blood splattering over the Duke. Marlborough did not flinch. He wiped the blood from his coat, remounted, and continued to direct the charge. The psychological impact of seeing their commander survive such carnage galvanized his men. The French line collapsed completely. Unlike Blenheim, which was a hard-fought slugging match, Ramillies was a rout. The French army dissolved, losing 13,000 men to Marlborough's 1,000. In the weeks that followed, city after city in Flanders threw open its gates to the Duke. He had conquered an entire country in a single afternoon, not with brute force but with a magic trick. Yet, as his military star reached its zenith, the shadows at home were lengthening. The political landscape in London was shifting. The Queen's affection for Sarah Churchill was cooling, replaced by the whispering influence of new favourites, and the English public, fickle as ever, was beginning to ask a dangerous question. Was this war being fought for the safety of the nation, or to line the pockets of the Duke of Marlborough? The architect of greatness was about to find that his enemies in London were far more dangerous than the French marshals he defeated on the field. By 1709, the war had ground on for 8 long years. Europe was exhausted. France was a nation of skeletons, ravaged by famine and the cost of the conflict. King Louis XIV, humbled and desperate, sued for peace. He offered terms that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier, essentially surrendering everything the Allies had fought for. But the British government, intoxicated by Marlborough's victories, demanded too much. They insisted that Louis not only surrender Spain, but use his own army to remove his grandson from the Spanish throne. It was a humiliation too far. Louis rejected the terms and issued a stirring appeal to his people. If I must fight, I will fight my enemies, not my children. The war resumed, but the nature of it changed. The French were no longer fighting for dynastic ambition. They were fighting for national survival. The mood turned dark and desperate. And it was in this grim atmosphere that Marlborough marched toward the fortress of Mons, meeting the French army near the woods of Malplaquet. The Battle of Malplaquet, fought on September 11th, 1709, was the terrifying inverse of Blenheim. At Blenheim, Marlborough had used movement to avoid slaughter. At Malplaquet, he had no choice but to walk into it. The French commander, Marshal Villars, a man as capable as Marlborough, had constructed formidable defensive earthworks between 2 dense woods. He had created a kill box. Marlborough's plan was a blunt instrument, a massive hammer blow to shatter the French entrenchments. For 6 hours, the Allied infantry marched into the mouths of the French cannons. The Dutch Blue Guards were mown down in windrows, losing 5,000 men in 30 minutes. The British infantry fought a savage hand-to-hand struggle in the darkened woods of Tignières, bayonet against bayonet in the gloom. The Allies eventually broke the French line, and Villars retreated, leaving Marlborough in possession of the field. But it was a victory of ashes. The Allied army had suffered over 24,000 casualties, double that of the defeated French. It was the bloodiest day of the 18th century, a record of carnage that would stand until Napoleon marched into Russia 100 years later. A shaken French officer wrote, "The ground was so covered with dead that we could not see the earth." Marlborough, riding over the corpse-strewn field, was physically sickened. He wrote to a friend, "I am so tired that I have but strength enough to tell you we have had this day a very bloody battle." In London, The news of Malplaquet was not greeted with bonfires, but with horror. The political opposition, the Tories, seized upon the casualty lists. They branded Marlborough a butcher who was feeding British blood into a meat grinder to satisfy his own ego and greed. The political ground beneath his feet crumbled. The Queen, poisoned against the Churchills by Sarah's increasingly erratic and disrespectful behaviour, finally snapped. The lifelong friendship between the Queen and the Duchess ended in a storm of shouting and slammed doors. Without Sarah's protection, John was vulnerable. His enemies did not attack his military record. That was unimpeachable. Instead, they attacked his wallet. They launched an investigation into his accounts, discovering that he had taken a 2.5% commission on the bread contracts for the army in the Low Countries and had deducted 2.5% from the pay of foreign mercenary troops. Marlborough argued that this was standard practice, perquisites used to fund his secret service and spy network, a network that had provided the intelligence for his greatest victories. It didn't matter. The facts were irrelevant. The politics were decisive. The narrative was set. The Duke was a war profiteer, prolonging the conflict to fill his coffers, while English sons died in the mud. On December 31st, 1711, Queen Anne dismissed him from all his offices. The man who had saved the kingdom, who had broken the power of France, and who had raised the British army to the pinnacle of glory, was fired like a dishonest servant. He was stripped of his command, dragged through the press, and eventually forced into self-imposed exile in Europe. The architect had been pulled down by the very people whose freedom he had secured. For 2 years, the greatest soldier in Europe lived as a wanderer, drifting between the German principalities he had once liberated. He was greeted with gun salutes and cheering crowds in Frankfurt and Antwerp, treated as a hero abroad while he remained a pariah at home. But the wheel of fortune, which had spun so wildly throughout his life, had one final turn left. In 1714, Queen Anne died. With her death, the Stuart dynasty was extinguished, and the German House of Hanover ascended the British throne. King George III arrived in England with a long memory. He remembered who had led the Grand Alliance to victory. One of his first acts was to recall Marlborough from exile. The Duke returned to London in triumph, his carriage mobbed by adoring crowds who had conveniently forgotten their previous hatred. He was restored to his position as Captain General, his titles and honours returned. But the man who put on the uniform was no longer the Titan of Blenheim. He was 64 years old, battered by decades of campaigning and heartbroken by the death of his favourite daughter. The sharp, crystal-clear mind that had outmanoeuvred the French Empire was beginning to cloud. In 1716, he suffered a severe stroke that left him with a speech impediment. The angel of the battlefield, whose voice had once commanded 100,000 men above the roar of cannon fire, was reduced to a slur. He spent his final years at Blenheim Palace, the monument to his glory that was still under construction. It is said that in his twilight, he would often have himself wheeled into the great hall to gaze at the tapestry of the Battle of Blenheim. On one occasion, staring at the woven image of his younger self leading the charge, he was heard to murmur, "That was a great man once." On June 16th, 1722, John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, died at Windsor Lodge. He was 72. His funeral was a spectacle of imperial grandeur, his hearse followed by the greatest in the land, burying not just a man, but an era. So how do we judge him? The ledger of his life is a chaotic mix of the sublime and the sordid. There is no denying the dark side, the treachery of 1688, the double dealing with James II, the insatiable hunger for money that tainted his reputation. He was a man who could charm a bird from a tree and then bill it for the conversation. He was a political survivalist who put his own safety above his loyalty to kings. But set against these flaws is a military genius of such magnitude that it altered the trajectory of the world. Before Marlborough, the British army was a joke, After him, it was the most professional fighting force in Europe. He taught the British soldier that he could beat the French. He replaced the defensive mindset of the 17th century with a doctrine of aggression, movement, and psychological dominance. He understood that in war, the moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1. His legacy echoes through the centuries. His methods, the use of logistics to enable strategic surprise, the integration of infantry and cavalry, the seeking of the decisive battle, became the blueprint for British commanders for 200 years. But his bloodline provided an even greater legacy. 2 centuries after his death, another Churchill, his direct descendant, Winston, would sit in the exact same room at Blenheim Palace, writing a biography of his great ancestor. Winston Churchill studied Marlborough's life obsessively, absorbing the lessons of coalition warfare, of standing alone against a continental tyrant, and of the resilience required to endure political wilderness. It is not an exaggeration to say that the spirit of John Churchill helped guide Britain through its darkest hour in 1940. John Churchill was the founder. He found Britain a small island nation and left it a global superpower. He was a man of immense contradictions, a hero who was also a hustler, a saviour who was also a sinner. But perhaps that is the nature of true genius. It does not exist in the sterile vacuum of perfection. It thrives in the messy, ambitious, and often compromised reality of the human condition. He was, in the end, the sword that carved the British Empire out of the chaos of history. Thank you for listening to our story. If you found this history as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to British War History for more. We read all of your comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next video.